Hi again guys, and welcome to episode 1 of our 5th new review series. This series is called SuperSports, and the name kind of speaks for itself. It is reviewing the SuperSports cars of Gran Turismo 6. Now, for the sake of clarification, a SuperSports car in this setting is a vehicle which is in the exotic category. It's beyond the performance of a sports car, so something like a Porsche Boxster or a BMW Z4, but not quite the level of a true supercar. So faster than something like a Porsche Boxster, but slower than, say, a Carrera GT. Somewhere between the two. So, for instance, a 911 Turbo. Now, obviously, the 911 Turbo is not on the game, but that's just an example. And what better way to start this series than by featuring one of the best looking and most popular cars of this class, the Alfa Romeo 8C Competizione. Now, this is a Maserati-based vehicle. It's powered by a 4.7 litre naturally aspirated Maserati V8. For those who are unfamiliar with the term, naturally aspirated means that the car is not turbocharged or supercharged. That's just the natural power of the engine. And it's a pretty good looking car. Now, I'm not going to say that I'm a huge fan of this car, because I'm not. I do, however, think that it is a good looking car, and I know that many people agree. Now, in terms of this car's purpose, it's not designed for racing. And it's actually one of the very few supersports cars that isn't used for racing. Many of them do end up having racing versions and being used in competition, such as the Vantage, the Gran Turismo, etc. They do end up being used for racing in some form or another. The Alfa Romeo is kind of unique in that it hasn't been, or not to my knowledge anyway. So what does it have to offer? Because not being a competition model could potentially give it a disadvantage in racing. Well, fully tuned, it sits at 576 pp, which is actually very good, because by lowering it by just 1 pp brings it obviously perfectly to 575, in which it is very competitive. Now, in terms of its fully tuned state, it puts out 682 horsepower, which is a pretty decent amount of power. It's not class leading, but it's more than enough to get the job done. And unsurprisingly, the torque level is lower than the power, which is a common trait of supersports cars. It actually produces 469 pound-feet of torque, which, again, isn't record-breaking, but it's more than enough to get the job done. As far as weight, it's kind of falls into the moderate category. It's not particularly heavy, but it's not the lightest either. It weighs 1,268 kilos with the full weight loss package, so reasonably good weight. Not particularly amazing, but definitely not too heavy either. And the power to weight ratio is pretty good. It's 538 horsepower per tonne, which is a decent power to weight ratio for a supersports car to have. What about in terms of actual performance though? Well, for acceleration, it does fall behind some of its rivals. Now, it's still definitely not slow, but it is slower in acceleration than, for instance, a Ferrari Scuderia, which is one of its main rivals. In terms of top speed, you're looking in the 240 mph region, which is around the same as the car from which it got its engine, the Maserati Gran Turismo, and that is impressive because the Maserati does have more power, but this car still has the same kind of top-end performance. So that's a good start for this Alfa Romeo. But what about for handling? Because obviously, as we said, this is not a competition-based model, so it's not designed to set lap records. So how does it perform on the track? Is it just a poser's car that cannot back up its looks? Well, no, it's not. I'm not going to say that it's the best track machine out there, because it's not. There are other supersports cars which will give you much quicker laps, such as the aforementioned Ferrari Scuderia. But it is definitely not a slow car. Its pace is very good, the handling is very smooth and surprisingly controlled for a front-engine, rear-drive supersports car with the amount of power that it has. You would expect it to be a lot slipperier than it actually is. Now, that said, it does drift very well, but when you want it to, which is exactly the way you want the car to be. You don't want to be wrestling against the car when you're trying to get a good lap, and this car does control itself very well. It's also fairly consistent. The handling doesn't really shock you at any time. The traits that are perhaps not so good in its handling, of which there aren't that many, at least are consistent. So they don't happen on some corners and not others. The handling is very consistent on this car. Overall, what's the verdict? Well, if you're looking for a pure racing machine, perhaps not. If you're looking for something that looks great, that's great for cruising, and if you're the kind of person who's more concerned with what the car looks like as you cross the line, rather than what position you're in when you cross the line, then this is probably the car for you. Think of it more as a work of art with a steering wheel, rather than a pure racing machine. In some ways, this car is actually quite similar to the Maserati MC12, in that it's based on a car with more power and better weight, but is more of a piece of art rather than to win races. So overall, it's a very good car. Perhaps not for winning races, but it's a great collector's car. It's the kind of car which is just nice to own because it's a fine piece of potential automotive history at some point in the future. So that's it for our first episode of this series. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.